without further ado, Mr. Sam Ham.
I always love that tradition. You don't actually have a clue about what's coming. And so, I mean, all this applause, you may take it back at the end, but we'll see how we go. Jennifer and Amber, thank you. Chris Montero, who's really instigated this whole thing, thanks, Chris. I'm happy to do this. I love doing this kind of thing. We're local now, and so I worked in 60 countries almost, you know. And in 40 years at the University of Idaho, I think maybe twice I was asked to speak in the state of Idaho. You know, you're never a pilgrim in your own land, or you know, what do they call it, a prophet in your own land. You always have to go elsewhere. You know, I guess if you carry a briefcase with slides and stuff, you're an expert, and then you go all over the world and people. But at home, nobody cares what you have to say. So anyway, it's nice to be asked to do something here locally. This is great. Jennifer and Amber contacted me, really, as I said, at the behest of Chris, to talk about a professional field that I've been in. And yes, communication psychology, or psychology of communication, is a bona fide branch of cognitive psychology. So generally, I'm a cognitive psychologist and a behavioral psychologist. I do a lot of work in the use of communication to influence human behavior, which we can talk about today if you like. Quite a lot is known about it, and there are quite a lot of myths and misconceptions about how those 2 points might line up: communication input and behavioral output. So if you're interested, we can chat about that. But what they wanted me to do was to sort of talk about this field of interpretation, or environmental interpretation in your case. I do a lot of work with heritage interpretation. I just was last week in Mexico, speaking and doing workshops on archaeological interpretation. As you know, in Mexico, they have huge archaeological resources, Mayan and Aztec both. And I do a lot of work in sustainable tourism, tourism destination areas. One of my specific focuses is a behavioral sort of issue. It's in travelers' philanthropy. The whole idea is to take people to the world's special places, blow them away, create the opportunity for a bond between the person and the place, and then give them an opportunity to act on that bond before they leave, monetarily, right? And we've raised over $6 million for the Galapagos Islands, you know, and that's just in a few years, you know, using the approach that I'll talk about today. In fact, once we rolled it out, the donations within 6 months quadrupled, right? So I'm not going to make anything up today. I'm also not going to tell you how to do your job. I can't possibly, because in communication of all kinds, and certainly what you people do is communication, at least in part, all things are 100% dependent on the audience, or audience dependent. You know your audiences. That's a huge advantage in any kind of communication. And I don't know your audiences, so I can't possibly tell you how to do your job. But what I do want to do is impact your point of view about it. I'd like to offer you today a way of looking at your job, a new set of blinders, if you like, so that maybe tomorrow you'll wake up and you kind of look at what the task in front of you is a little differently. And I hope that it's informed by the evidence that I give you today. I'm not going to talk, you know, esoteric, you know, academic research with you, but I am going to share with you some of the evidence and why it's so compelling. It has been accumulated in just the last 25 years that most people in my field, in the interpretation field, are only beginning to be aware of, and that's largely because I'm working really hard to make them aware of it, along with some other folks. I've written over 400 publications, and half of them have been in environmental education journals, and some of them in environmental or interpretation research journals, and then some other kinds of places, right? I am often asked, in fact, this was a subject of discussion, serious academic debate back in the 1970s. What is the difference between interpretation and environmental education? That question was driven more by people who needed to establish themselves as being in a legitimate professional field than it had to do with any real empirically meaningful, substantive sort of difference between what those two fields are trying to do. Often, whether you are an environmental educator or an interpreter is a matter of what your job title is. where you are in the budget line item, where your money comes from, and what you need to say that you do in order to justify that expenditure. And that has real meaningful implications for people, because opportunities for advancement, professional development and advancement and all those sorts of things are on the line, right? And so I get it. That's really important. But as a psychologist, I could never understand why it would be important to distinguish between them. And I'll tell you why. Because it occurred to me a long time ago that if somehow all the world's leading thinkers, and believe me, I've put myself on the sideline now because the question to me is almost inconsequential. If all those people could come up now with a definitive, absolutely mutually exclusive definition of the two, environmental education is this, interpretation is this, would any of us get up tomorrow and do our jobs differently? I don't see it. I was out at the Billy Frank Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge just last week, helping my grandsons. One of the reasons I'm local is my grandsons live here, helping his class with a field trip out there. And I went in, I introduced myself in the education building to the head of the program, and then to the volunteers who were there to help. I was a chaperone from the school, not part of the refuge effort. And so I said to this young man who was the staff person, I said, so are you an interpreter out here? And he goes, no, I'm an environmental educator. And I thought, and that was important to him. He was clear to make that distinction. And he said, and I know you wrote the book. And I said, yeah. I said, yeah. I said, I wrote a book, but that's not my I said, but I'll guarantee you, on your best day, on your very most successful day, on the day that you make a difference, that some kid out here is going to come back and tell you about 20 years ago, kind of like the conversation, where's Dan? That Dan and I just had. Thank you again for that. You were an interpreter that day. Because I cannot look at environmental education as a distinct communication field from environmental interpretation. To me, interpretation is not a function. It's not a job title. It is an approach to communication. And that's frankly what put my work on the world's map back in the late 1880s. You see, right after the wheel. 1980s. Did I really just say that? I did, didn't I? I promise you it was 1980s, not the 1880s. And well, I'm really happy to be here because I'm 66 now, and I'm happy to be anywhere and know why I'm there. And I just kind of made a faux pas there. Is because what I did was basically, as a student of communication, my daughter called me a shrink that wears earth colors at one time when she was 11 years old. It's pretty insightful, actually, for an 11-year-old. And that's really true. She told a friend that. What's your dad do? Well, he's a shrink that wears earth colors. That came out of her mouth. Of course, you always, parents, you do listen around the corner when your kids are having conversations. And that's what I did. I was, it was years ago when I worked for the National Park Service, I used to give guided walks through the whole rainforest in Olympic National Park. And that place blew me away. I mean, things grow so fast out there. If you're very quiet, you can almost hear them growing. 12 feet of rain a year and all that. I mean, that even puts Olympia to shame, doesn't it? And just amazing place. Man, you got trees. They got diameter from here to the wall wide. It takes you several seconds to walk around them, and you've got this incredible overstory and this thick understory, and the elk come through every morning. And if you're up early enough, you can see their breath, and you're only feet away from them. This is a really, really amazing place. And I used to go out there and get goosebumps. But it wasn't too long into that job, and when after 30 or 40 guided walks with visitors from all over the place, is normal people. Normal people. Tells you something about us, doesn't it? The only way to define normal is a statistical inference. That's my phone. If you outnumber the other guys, you're normal. It's as simple as that. That's what normal is, right? And so normal people, just want to leave that with you just for some thought. And they weren't getting the same goosebumps. And it was then, and that was in the 1970s, that I realized they're different than me. I'm not the audience. And I then, as a young student of communication psychology, of cognitive psychology, just started on a path, a journey, to try to understand, to find the pathways and the mechanisms through which it was even plausible, not by intuiting it, but I wanted hard evidence, cause and effect relationships between communication input and some type of desired outcome, right? That's what I'm going to talk to you about this morning, and hopefully this leads to a discussion that's useful. Just the day before yesterday, just ironically, I was asked by actually through a colleague, actually, Chris, this was through Jorge Morales again. Jorge Morales from Spain contacts me and says, this group in Argentina that wants you to write, I speak Spanish and I do a lot of work in Latin America. That's why this happens. They want you to write a little statement for their webpage, this new group. And you all have a copy of it that talks about what interpretation is and why it's important. And so I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see the kinds of things that I say because they are very much connected. I'll just leave that to take away, and you can, sort of maybe look at it later as a footnote to what we talk about today. But that's very much the way I see what interpretation is. It is not an activity. It is not just a budget line item. It is not just some function that's called for in some administrative manual when you look at the mission of an organization or an agency. Yes, it is those things because people have to have a job title and you got to be in the budget somewhere. But to me, interpretation has always been an approach to communication. It's been a way of looking at communication, right, that applies what now I would say about 2 centuries of solid empirical evidence about how communication can actually influence a human being, including us, the abnormal ones. Well, the not normal ones. The abnormal is not to mean aberrant, but we're not the audience. So that's what I would like to share with you today. And I'm going to do that by talking about making a difference. And I always say, and this is the subtitle of my book, Making a Difference on Purpose. By that, I mean not crossing your fingers and hoping to get lucky. Everybody you see is an expert in communication. We always have been, all of us. Why? Because we do it every day. We have lots of practice. We all tie our shoes well, too, because we do it every day. You know how to brush your teeth. We do it every day. Well, you should. And we have strong opinions about what, in quotation marks, what works and what doesn't work. And a lot of those opinions are valid for you because we all have our own personal experience, which mainly comes from interpersonal communication. But when we're talking about talking to people through whatever medium, communicating with people who are not like us, who are normal people, who are far more diverse than people in this room, not only in terms of socio-demographic characteristics, which are almost irrelevant, but in terms of their values, in terms of what they know, in terms of subjective understanding of the world they walk into your programs with, right? They're different. When we talk about communicating with the aggregate, with the mass of humanity that I call normal people, even though we could divide them more, into segments, if you like. But they are certainly not like us most of the time. And think about it. If they were like us and we were like them, there would be no reason for you to be doing your job because they'd already think like you, they'd already care like you care, and they'd already behave like you behave, wouldn't they? Right? So you're out of work just like that. So think of this as job security. Are you following me? So what is this approach to communication? Well, making a difference on purpose means applying this approach to communication based upon the empirical evidence behind it, right? And knowing that the likelihood of achieving an outcome you want to achieve, and we'll talk about what those outcomes might be here in a moment, right? But knowing that achieving one or more of those outcomes is, in a statistical sense, significantly better than if you just make it up, cross your fingers and hope to get lucky, which is the way many of us approach our programs now because we have no model of change in our minds. And so basically what my life's work has been is trying to one, research, develop the model, and then hand it over in a form that is usable to people who are not psychologists. And so that's basically what I'm going to try to do today. As I said, I want to impact your point of view about this, and that's where this model comes in, because I think, I hope anyway, when you consider the model and the evidence behind it, that you're going to go, you know what? I'm just going to start thinking that way about it. Now, let me get going here with some slides. How many of you would raise your hand and say yes? I don't see one hand and not going up. Duh. I mean, this is what the veritable softball question, isn't it, for a group, right? How obvious is that? Is it your moral responsibility to protect the environment for people you don't know? How about for people who aren't even born yet? Yeah. How about especially them? You see, yeah, we're revealing something about ourselves here. Well, let's keep going here. Is preserving biodiversity a worthy end in and of itself? Without any further justification? Raise your hand if you agree with that. Now, wait a minute. How about species that have no known utilitarian or economic value? How about especially those? You see? And then, because I believe, and a lot of people do, that the creation of libraries was one of the most important inventions human beings ever came up with. Oops, didn't mean to do that. How many of you raise your hand and say yes to this? Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is if we actually learn from the past, we quit making the same mistakes over and over again. It actually isn't working out that way, if you've noticed, right? But that is the premise of it. All right, now, what have you just shown? You've shown that you're weird. And this is, again, I come back to the normal curve. You're not part of this math of humanity, right? You're out here in either the lunatic fringe or the cutting edge. And, of course, we like to think we're out here, but a lot of people think you're out there. You've heard the euphemisms, right? Fern feelers, earth muffins, you know, not particularly. So, right? So, I mean, but we hope that history proves us right, because we are armed after all, with the science of sustainability. We understand the dynamic equilibrium in an ecosystem that has natural integrity, do we not? Right? And sometimes we think if we could just put that knowledge in everybody else's heads, they'd think and care and act just like we do, right? Well, we'll come back to that. How about tonight we all go to see, is it Charlie's Bar and Grill down here? I've had lunch, isn't it? It's Charlie's, right? Right on Main Street or on the street. Yeah, that's out of the Main Street. I've eaten there once, had lunch there with a fellow. And fun little place, nice little sports bar. Imagine we all head down there tonight, and we have a few, and one of you successfully persuades me to jump up on the bar and say to everybody else, "Hey, everyone, I want to ask you some questions." And I ask those 3 questions. You think all those hands are going to be flying up like they just did in this group? No, there'll be some. But it'll be far more diverse, won't it? You see, these are normal people. They're not us. They're not better. They're not worse. They're just different. And when we set out to think about communication and environmental education strategically, we've got to start with the premise that in communication, all things are 100% audience dependent, right? And they are not like us. I see a lot of environmental educators with goodness and with motives of pure gold who just want to save the world, right? And get up and do programs aimed at people just like them, just like themselves, right? Where they assume they're the audience. And this is the main thing we've got to work on. People like us want to make some kind of difference. I've talked to interpreters, environmental educators in almost 60 countries and all kinds of languages and places of different cultural traditions. They eat different food. They watch different types of television if they even have them. They laugh at different types of humor. They listen to different types of music. To the eye and the ear and all of our sensory mechanisms, we look different. But when you sit down and you talk to an environmental educator or an interpreter anywhere in the world, how despite these other comparatively superficial differences, and you start talking about what really matters in life, you will find out just how homogeneous we are, just how much alike we are. I could name 2, 3, or 4, maybe up to 5 deep-seated values that we live by. We raise our children by these values. We vote by these values. We even wear clothes that are consistent with these values and comport ourselves in ways that are consistent with these values. and you share them with your colleagues, interpreters and environmental educators all over the world without any further discussion. It's an amazing thing. The interpretation and environmental education fields aren't the only fields that are, I would say, value laden, but they're one of the few. I mean, I can think of the clergy. Sometimes those parallels get a little spooky for me, actually, when I talk to my colleagues. But we are defined by our values, right? And so what kinds of differences do we want to make? Well, generally, they fall into three categories. The old triad. And I'll talk about audiences here because that's a generic term for whatever kinds of groups you work with. We want them to think certain things. We want them to feel and sometimes even emote. I mean, how many of you have emotional objectives you like to achieve with your groups? Right? I mean, this is very common among our group, and we use this word a lot. And sometimes we want them to behave in certain ways. Go home and do something different now that they've been to your program, right? I mean, that's a common outcome. And so cognitive, affective, and behavioral objectives to a psychologist. Right? Usually, we want our audiences to appreciate and to care. These are words that people in our field use a lot, right? How many of you hope that after participating in one of your programs that the people you worked with, whether kids or adults, will now appreciate something, right? How many of you want them to care? Right? You see, this is the whole thing. We want our audiences to appreciate what we appreciate and to care as we care, don't we? The U.S. National Park Service in 2011 put this perfectly, speaking specifically about interpretive programs in U.S. national parks. And they said, you know, visitors to our parks will only care for our parks, like protect them, be mindful of their impacts, et cetera, support them politically, economically, whatever the behavior is. They'll only care for the parks when they first care about them. You see, this is central to our own ideology, this appreciation and caring. They're attitudes. And that's where the psychologist in me comes in. These are the pluses and the minuses, the loves and the hates, the likes and the dislikes, right? This is what attitudes are. An appreciation of something is a generally positive attitude about it, right? So what do we know about communication and attitudes? And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time on today. Here is the way the intuitive let me make it up because I'm an expert in communication and also because I have no other model available to me, might think. It's called the learning leads to loving hypothesis. And the big assumption underlying it is that if they can just know what we know, they'll care as we care. And so my job then is to give them the knowledge. And typically we measure success or excellence by how much they can remember from the content that we transferred to them. So we give them some kind of a test that has questions that we make up these are the facts that are important to us. And if they can remember our facts, then we pat ourselves in the back and say we did a good job. And if they can't remember very much, then we think, well, we've got some improvement to do. Is that the way it goes? This is the way I would say over 70% of the empirical studies in refereed research journals evaluating environmental education and interpretive programs worldwide have evaluated success. And therefore, they have developed a construct of what constitutes excellence based upon how much their audiences can remember. Does this sound familiar? So we assume that if we can deepen a person's knowledge about something, that at some point there'll be a positive attitude. And that positive attitude will then figure in, help to shape future behaviors that they decide to do or not do, right? Now look, I don't want to throw ice water on a party, but I got to tell you, that does not hold up. Studies do not support this relationship. They never have. This learning leads to loving hypothesis has been tested directly several times. It always goes down in a ball of flame, and indirectly, probably tens of thousands of times. Every time somebody does a study and then they look for a correlation between some type of factual recall measure and some type of attitude measure, right? It doesn't hold up. We find, I don't know, one study, 170% increase in knowledge from an interpretive program about insects done in a national forest in California a few years ago, right? Zero impact on attitude. It doesn't hold up. But how many of you studied some type of in natural resources, biology, water in university? All right. How many? Okay. Now I have a question for you. Where were you in terms of your educational journey? A first year freshman, a sophomore, junior, senior? How far did you go? How much did you learn before you finally cared? It's a dumb question, isn't it? How many of you decided to study those fields because you already cared? See, folks, this is a lie we keep telling ourselves, that if we can pound knowledge in these people's heads, that somehow they're going to appreciate and care. It doesn't hold up. It is not a realistic assumption about a cause and effect relationship, because there is no empirical evidence that teaching people your facts is going to lead them to appreciate or care about anything, right? Learning doesn't lead to loving. Loving leads to learning. And this is what recent studies tell us. When you care about something already, you're motivated to learn about it, aren't you? Isn't that what drives it? How many of you have already learned enough? Raise your hand if you've learned enough. You see, you love this stuff. You're never going to be done learning. Is that right? Okay. If you get nothing else out of today, not a thing. If you go to sleep, maybe some of you are already, get up, walk out, whatever. If you get nothing else, I want you to get this. This is a lie we tell ourselves. Why? Because giving a test is an easy way to evaluate something. It's convenient. It's expedient. Just ask any master's student. I only got 2 years and I got to do a study to get this master's degree done. So, hey, I'll make up a test and see if people can remember stuff. And it's been called everything from, not just learning. Learning is a tough thing to define, folks. And one way to define learning, I guess, is if people can faithfully vomit back to you your facts, right? It's been called enlightenment, enrichment. Your life is richer because you remember my facts. How cool is that? That's one study. I was actually an external on a PhD dissertation. They call them theses in Australia, and I was the external reader that they have to have. And this is what this guy called it. He said, yeah, you can remember facts after taking my self-guided trail on forest ecology or something. Why teach park visitors forest ecology? I still don't get that part. But anyway, if you can answer the questions on my test, the ones I made up, pulled right out of because if you came up with a test, then it might be different questions altogether, right? So it begs the question of completely arbitrary, doesn't it? What a silly idea. If you get nothing else, I hope it is the firm conclusion that we got to look at it differently. We got to look at it differently. Well, what do we know? We know, and this is now on the basis of hundreds of published studies just since the mid-1980s, and they're ongoing today. Studies on 2 theoretical models. They're both awful names. One is called the elaboration likelihood model. Google that, please, sometime. Elaboration likelihood. And you'll see several million hits, and you'll see that this research is applied in every field imaginable in a field of applied communication, from teaching to advertising to public relations to propaganda to good old-fashioned just mind-molding persuasive communication, political campaigning, courtroom argumentation. I do workshops for lawyers sometimes. Did you realize that? I also do them for marketing firms. And I also do them for environmental educators and interpreters, lots of science and math teachers, because sometimes they need a lot of help. Same soup, different potatoes. La misma sopa con papas diferentes, Chris. The same brain, the same human brain involved in all of them. Why can I not distinguish between environmental education and interpretation? Because it's an approach to communication that's going to serve you well, regardless of whether you're dealing with a group of park visitors or a group of school kids. Doesn't matter. Now, how much your communication can influence someone is not based on how much they can remember. They may remember very little or nothing. even after your best effort, if you gave them a test of immediate recall on the spot and you gave it to enough of those people, 100 or more, you're going to start to get this normal curve. The best you can do is mediocrity, average. But if you come back 24 hours later, it's going to be skewed to the low end. If you come back a week later, don't even waste your time, because they're going to forget virtually everything you said, unless they already knew about it or unless it was reinforced in a fairly immediate time frame. Right? And then there might be some residue there. Or it just struck a nerve. But that, of course, would be different from person to person. So statistically, what you'll find is that no long-term memory and average short-term memory. What does that tell you? Well, if instead you talk to those people ahead of time and you found out, or not ahead of time, but after your presentation, sit them down, talk to them, and ask them what they're thinking. What are you thinking now? Your thoughts, your thoughts, your thoughts. You'll find they're different. This is what elaboration is, by the way. It's thinking. It's effortful thought. That's what elaboration is. It's giving something a good think. It's not just, casual. It's pondering, deliberating, contemplating. Wondering is a great synonym in our field for what elaboration is, right? It's just processing information. It's making meanings. And every thought makes a meaning. Even if it's wrong, even if it's factually challenged, even if it is morally objectionable to you, it nevertheless is a thought they had that you stimulated by something you said or showed. If you then gave them a test, after listening to what they said they were thinking about, then you went back and you made up a test based upon what they said they were thinking, and you gave it to them, they'd get 100% every time, wouldn't they? Wouldn't they? You see, it's what they think. It's what they think that makes a difference. This is what these studies on elaboration likelihood show, that the more you stimulate another person to think about something, the more meanings they make, right? The more connections they make themselves through the process of thinking, right? The more likely that an attitude that is appreciative can result. The stronger that attitude will be. The more they think, the stronger it will be. This is well established. A strong attitude is resistant to counter-argumentation, so they're resilient. I mean, most of our, forget that. Most of our attitudes, that's right, I'll come back and change the slide once you fixed it. Most of our attitudes, and you have tens of thousands of attitudes, you have an attitude about almost virtually everything in your perceived reality, and most of them are neutral. You don't care one way or another. It's not positive, it's not negative, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just kind of neutral, right? And so these attitudes change really quickly. Somebody walks in, says that, and you think they know more than you about it, you think they're credible for whatever reason, they express an attitude, boom, you adopt their attitude, right? The next day, somebody else says something different, and boom, it changes again. This is the way most of our attitudes are. Thank you. I'll lay off of it now. Not these. The toughest nut you'll ever crack in persuasive communication, according to a lot of evidence, is the highly knowledgeable, highly experienced person who's thought a lot about something. The only thing that is actually harder to crack is an attitude that's based on personal experience. Now, I know we tried getting people in Yosemite National Park in a 3-year study there, people camping in Yosemite Valley simply to store their food in a government-provided food locker because of black bears danger, and we couldn't get them. We had a hard time convincing them to do it because they've been going to Yosemite. It's got like 40% repeat visitation. It's on the back door of Sacramento and San Francisco, right? So these people have been coming for generations every summer. They go camping in Yosemite. They've never had a bear problem. And so now the government's telling them there's a bear problem. You see, so their experience is making it hard to convince them to do the right thing, right? Well, next to that, though, somebody who's thought a lot about something, right? That is a tough nut to crack. The more you stimulate people to think their own thoughts, make their own meanings, to elaborate, the stronger and the more resilient the attitude that results can be. And in behavioral psychology, we know, lots of studies support this, that strong attitudes guide behavioral choice. They say the strong lead and the weak follow. And when it comes to the attitude-behavior relationship, right? And so if you want to make a difference in how someone thinks, that's the thinking, that's the elaboration. Feels, that's the attitude. That's the good and bad, plus or minus. Appreciate, caring, all that stuff. And given the opportunity, behave, then you got to get people thinking. And you got to get them thinking in ways that lead them where you want them to go. Because you can stimulate them to think, but if they're thinking, no, I disagree, right? And questioning your integrity and your credibility, it's called biased processing. It leads to, and I do a lot of work in Australia, and they love this when I tell them, it's named after Aussies. It's called the boomerang effect. When you throw something out there and it comes back to bite, right? That's the boomerang effect. Because you can get them thinking in the opposite way and get the same strong attitude and the same predictive attitude that is strong, resilient, and predictive behavior, but in the direction opposite of what you wanted, right? So the key is to get them thinking, and I'll end on this idea. I call it the zone of tolerance. How much you influence your audience to think is the main difference between success and failure. The more you blow them away, I always teach, we're not trying to teach nothing to nobody. We're just trying to blow them away. How many of you read a good book recently in the last year or two? The book you couldn't put down? Really, I mean, just every night you race to bed to get the book and read it. Some of you snuck it to work. Did you do that? You know the book I'm talking about? It's the book you're laying there, and often I have a book on my bedside, and I'm laying in bed. And most books I have laying on my bedside, not only do I read them because I'm interested in them, but because ultimately they serve a higher purpose, which is getting me to sleep. Not this one. This is the one that when I realize I'm nodding off, I slap myself and I shake my head because I want to get another chapter in, don't I? Maybe a whole. I don't want to end this. You know what I'm saying? And with every page, I get closer and closer, inevitably, to the end. And toward the last 100 pages or so, you start to feel remorse already. You're going, God, I don't want this book to end. I want it to go on forever. Raise your hand if you know that feeling. And you've had it. Okay, so you're with me on this. I want you to think of that book. I want you to think, if you're like me, it's just happening in bed, but it could be anywhere. But say you're laying in bed, and finally, inevitably, ultimately, you get to the last page, last paragraph, last sentence, last word. And now this amazing journey has ended. And you close that book. Your chin goes up, mainly because it's no really place for it to go down, but usually goes up, and these are me. And I think one sort of summative, overall general thought that goes something like this. Wow. Right? Wow. Man. Now what then if Amber or Jennifer ran into my room with a clipboard and wanted to give me a test over the facts of that book? Can you sense how different those two worlds are? What's going on in my mind, which is a result of a communication event, and whatever might be on your friggin' clipboard are two different realities, and they're not related. Are you following me on this? Right? Okay. So, making people think. Now, hopefully this works again. How am I doing for time? I'm doing all right for time. Good. Aha. Oops. I went, that's because I've got it upside down. Right now you've got me challenged here. Here's another take home that I hope at this point will make sense to you. How much any of us can care, and us included, how much any of us is even capable of caring will be based on the thoughts we ourselves have thought and the meanings we ourselves have made between our own two ears, and it can come from nowhere else. You want someone to appreciate and care? Get them to do the thinking. That's your job. Your facilitators of meaning making. That's what you got to do. Even if some of their ideas are factually challenged or far-flung, it still remains the fact that the only caring they're capable of doing will come from those thoughts. That's what studies show. So let's get them thinking. this is the model. I'm not going to walk you through it. There's plenty out there. I'm happy to send you. Follow with me. I'll send you publications. I'd send you the book, but I can't because my publisher would kill me if I did. But you don't write books to make money in my field, believe me. You write books to make a difference, and that's what what we want to do. But if you ask for particular interest, I might send you another chapter. So just whatever that's worth. I'm not saying anything. Fulcrum Publishing, this is legit. So you just stay over there. This is based upon a couple of centuries of research, right? And significantly informed in the last 25 years based upon research on the elaboration likelihood model, and a parallel model that actually developed independently from it with the same sort of general theoretical focus and very consistent findings that I hesitate to mention, only because if you think elaboration likelihood is hard to get your tongue around, try heuristic systematic processing model, HSM. And these two and the research independently has corroborated one another. This is solid stuff. Today, the elaboration likelihood model is by far the most studied, the most applied, and most supported theoretical model in the history of cognitive science. Now, that's a statement, but I think you can verify it simply on the number of studies that are published, even to this day, that apply this model and in some way or another test its veracity. The model, this TOR model, you can see a thematic communication, which is sort of what I'm known for, is really, it used to be EROT, but people kept adding an I and a C to the end to make it erotic. And so I flipped it around. That's true. They did. Even an article published, a couple of Aussies did that. Informative, no, imaginative and creative or something added to it, just for the sake of the friggin' acronym, right? These four letters they don't mean anything. I mean, some people put an S in front of it now, STORE, because I do make the point, you got to have a strong theme. A strong theme is the theme that already makes you think. I'll come back to what a theme is in a second. The O, the R, and the E. This is 3/4 of your job. You see there are four letters, and there are three of them, right? So it's 3/4 of your job. Entertainment. Infotainment, if you will. You make something easy to follow so people don't get lost. Make it connect to what matters to them. It's relevant for the visitor. This is obviously aimed at a park or museum type of audience, right? But for the audience. And make it enjoyable or attractive, appealing to process. That doesn't mean it has to be funny or lighthearted or, with a bunch of levity. It could be a very scary. I mean, look what Steven Spielberg's done, right? Scary stuff. Watch the evening news, a lot of blood and gore and guts or stories about tragic events that have happened to people, right? I know, but it is our species. Our minds are attracted to that stuff, and this is why it sells, right? So just being completely objective about it. So enjoyable doesn't necessarily mean fun and laughter, right? But it could be, right? But if you make it those three things, easy to follow, connect to what people already care about in your audience. All things are audience dependent, so it's what they care about, not just you, right? And make it enjoyable to process. They will pay attention until the cows come home. That's what entertainment literally means. Entretener, right? To hold within, to hold another person's attention. That's what entertainment is. Literally. And to a psychologist, that's what it is. In this sense, if you put your hand on a hot stove, it's entertaining because it definitely captures your attention, doesn't it? Right? But not necessarily in a pleasurable way, so it wouldn't qualify with the E there, not necessarily. But here's the difference. There's a model of interpretation. It's one of these naive models that's still out there where we time people. How long do they read an exhibit? Or if it's a presentation of some time. We actually have done photography, time-lapse photos where people's eyes seem to be focused, assuming that if they're looking at the communicator, then it's more engaging, which is certainly if you're doing this, it's not engaging. But, of course, if you're provoked to think, what do we usually do? Wow. So you see there's a little bit of error. And also when you're timing how long people spend reading stuff. Well, come on, if it's really poorly written, it might take them 10 minutes to get through a paragraph, going back and reading over and over. So there's really limitation to that. But the whole point of it is that holding an audience's attention as an end in itself. Doesn't guarantee, and there's no empirical evidence to suggest it even could or should lead to anything else. That's the difference between what you do, which is 3/4 entertainment, and what somebody in the entertainment industry is an ORE industry, what they do is different. And the difference is this. When the stand-up comic is done with the routine and has you laughing for 60 minutes, his or her impact ends with the final applause. Every environmental educator I've ever known, every interpreter I've ever known that stayed with it for the long haul is totally unwilling to accept that, because you think rather that your impact can begin with the final applause. You get the difference. So entertainment, and the entertainment industry is a great industry. We need a little more levity and laughter in the world we live in. It's pretty serious right now, have you noticed? So this is not a hit on the entertainment industry at all. But the difference between that industry and what you do is that for them, entertainment is an end in itself. For you, it's a means to an end. And that's where the T comes in. So let's talk about what this theme stuff is. I know a lot of people use the word theme to be synonymous with topic or subject matter. I mean, they'll say, "Oh, what's the theme of your presentation today?" Well, my theme is birds. That's not a theme. That's a topic. A theme is a whole idea. A theme can only be written in a sentence. Subject, verb, terminal punctuation, either a period or an exclamation mark. Period. Declarative sentence. It could be more than one sentence if they're closely related and together capture one whole idea that couldn't be captured with just one of those sentences. Sometimes people write very long themes that are so long they become run-on sentences and you end up getting lost in the words, whereas if they just put in a period or a semicolon between and break it up into two sentences, suddenly the power of the idea is released. To you, the communicator, there are two sides of theme. On your side, to you, a theme is your best friend. I tell you why. Because it helps you make tough decisions. You guys know a lot. You have the best education money can buy. You know a lot. You know so much. You're off the curve in your particular area of specialty. You realize that, of course. And so when you give a presentation or you develop a program for some group, right, you got to decide, given the time container you got to fill, you got to decide what to put in and what to leave out. And the latter turns out to be the toughest for you because you love it so much you want to include everything. Am I getting this right? I know, because I resemble that remark. When you've been years doing that. Right. So what's your theme? A theme to you is the main conclusion. Think of it as the moral of the story that you want to develop. And you want to develop so that your audience will not be able to parrot it back to you, repeat it, vomit it back to you, because a theme is just another fact, albeit a big and important one. But the idea is to get them to think their own thoughts around it. The moral of the story is what you want to be the focal point for their own. It's called provocation, as in thought provocation, provoking thinking, right? You want them to think their own thoughts around it. Because you got to get this elaboration idea. We want them to think their own thoughts and make their own meanings, because the only caring and appreciating they are capable of doing will have to come from those thoughts. And so we got to get them doing the thinking. And we give them information that causes this thinking to happen, knowing that most of that information will be forgotten relatively soon. But that's okay with us because it was never intended to be remembered forever. We're lousy hard disks. The human mind, the human cognitive architecture is designed to process information, not to store it. This is why we have libraries and museums and hard drives and thumb drives. I'm about ready to do it again. So get them thinking. The moral of the story. After going to my program today, I want my audience, this group of normal people, I want them to understand that. Complete the sentence. I always say writing a theme is as easy as that, because if you leave off that lead-in with the word that, you now must express what in English composition would be called an independent clause, which is a whole sentence. It could stand alone as this whole sentence. It would have a subject and a verb. I want them to understand. Now, how many of you programs about water? Just guessing. Quick, somebody complete that sentence for me. After one of your programs, you hope your audience will understand. You can change that verb. Appreciate, recognize, believe, accept, that. Complete the sentence. I want them to understand that. Theme, nice theme. I want to dress that theme up a little bit because it's still it's a little dry. For me and you, it's okay because that's important to us, but we're not the audience, right? So we need someone. This is what a strong theme is. A theme now is we always take a theme with a draft, and now we start to look at it, and we start to play with it and edit it with the audience in mind to craft it, to transform it into words that it has the same meaning, but is what provoke thinking in them. Good example. Years ago, I was working in Spain, and I'm doing a workshop on interpretation in the Rioja region, which is part of the Basque country of Spain, where they make great wine called Tempranillo wine. Tempranillo means a little early because this variety of how many of you know Rioja wines are Rioja? This grape Tempranillo ripens usually 2 to 3 weeks earlier than other varietals in the area. So it's called Tempranillo. And it's famous because it goes way, way back in Basque history. Over 1,500 years, they've been making wine with this grape. It is their wine. This is as much representative of their culture and who they are as any kind of grape. But the one thing you need to know about the Basques is that they have been persecuted over and over and over again. It seems like every dominant cultural group, right, that surrounds or integrates into where the Basques lived and still do in northern Spain has in some way tried to persecute them. Right? Do you know they have a language that is unique, that their language has no known root? It's in and of itself unique. It's the only unique language in the world. Every other language in the world can be that in so-called civilized countries. There's some indigenous languages, but even then, those have roots that are based on sharing with one another over time. But this one's unique. Francisco Franco, during his 36-year dictatorship in Spain, literally attempted genocide of these people. Literally attempted it. Couldn't pull it off. They were too resilient, and they are today. And they eat really well. And they've got great wines, right? Including this wine. Now, with this background, I'll tell you about this fellow who was in one of my workshops. And their job was to write a theme about something that they do in their work. And he worked at a winery in the Rioja region called Faustino, Tempranillo grape. And he came into class and into our workshop one day, and had a little table set up and a bottle of wine and little plastic cups, and poured a little bit in each plastic cup and set the bottle on the counter. And as we were all getting ready right here to sip it, he says, "With every sip of this wine, the blood and the toil of my ancestors will become part of you." The theme he started with was the Tempranillo grape has a long tradition in Spain, or in this part of the world. Right? That's where he started. But it turned into blood and toil of my ancestors, linking back to, you see the difference between the two themes? Right? Now, that's a really good example. Right? But the stronger your theme is, the more it alone, without any further development, the more the moral of the story that you want to develop already provokes thought, even without developing it yet. Right? The easier it is for you to get done what you want to get done, which is stimulating thinking, right? Because again, we want them to think their own thoughts around the theme. Right? Now I know that's a little bit, that's a brain twister, isn't it? Right? But I promise you, if you just start getting used to thinking in terms of writing sentences that are themes and developing programs that try to develop that theme, then you'll very good, like any other thing. You do it, you practice it, you get better and better at it. Pretty soon you find your stride with it and you're off and running. Am I right, Chris? Now, the other side of theme, so it's a tool that helps you decide what information to include or leave out, what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize. So it has practical value to you. But the other side of the theme is the audience side of the theme. This is where I've spent the last 15 years really focused. This is the psychologist in me. To them, To your audiences, themes are synonymous with the thoughts that they think and the meaning that they make, the connections that their minds make. One well-developed theme that you present and develop can give rise to plural, multiple themes. The more, the merrier. The more we stimulate people to elaborate, the more, look at this, I'm talking into the friggin' remote control now. Did anybody else paying attention? That's good. I'm just trying to be humble here, and I have plenty of reason to do that, believe me. Can you see that that's what you're trying to do? One theme gives rise to many, and the more themes you stimulate a person to generate in their own mind through the process of thinking, elaboration, contemplating, deliberating, wondering, whatever euphemism you want to put on it, right? The more you successfully do that, then the more likely you are, according to a vast body of evidence, to get people to care and appreciate, because again, the caring and appreciation they're able to do will have to come from those thoughts. That's the premise of what I'm saying to you. It's what audiences are actually thinking with respect to the things you communicated. Even though they may not pass your exam over the facts that you decide are important for them to remember, right? That doesn't matter. Studies show that often people will remember if they elaborate quite a bit of your content, right? But just because they don't, it doesn't mean you failed, because what you got to do is find out if they're thinking. It's how much they're thinking. That is the number of new thoughts they're thinking that are related to what you communicated to them, and what they're thinking about, right? Those two things are what I would call the metric of success, or if you like, a construct of excellence. Construct of excellence. Now, why is it important to have a construct of excellence? Well, because you hire people and you train them and you try to retain them based upon the skill sets you hope to have, right? The skill sets. Your construct of excellence drives all of that, right? I taught interpretation and environmental education at the university for almost 40 years, right? What I choose to teach my students and the skills I choose to help them develop are based upon my construct of excellence, aren't they? I want you to be really good at what you do. I want you to be excellent at it. And so it drives that whole process. So this is not a rhetorical question. Your construct of excellence, right, could be people in your group holding up test papers with 100% A+ gold stars on them because they remembered and faithfully vomited back to you every fact you gave them, right? And another construct of excellence could look like your audience applauding you. Bravo, encore, more. They were so entertained they can't get enough. What would this construct of success or excellence look like? People on their hands and knees, exhausted from all the thinking that you've caused them to do. I actually, in workshops, have my groups draw these little drawings. I actually thought of putting these. I didn't think I'd have time, but it turns out I did. I should have shown you some of these drawings that they've done, right? But this is the idea. People are blown away. I call these sentences in the head. Now, why would I call them that? Well, what's a theme? It's a sentence. Subject, verb, terminal punctuation, period or exclamation mark. In other words, not a question mark. A theme is a declarative sentence. It may lead to questions. That's a result of it. But the theme itself, the moral of the story, I want my audience to understand that, must be completed with a declarative sentence. You know how every psychologist I know, and probably all of them I don't know, see human operating memory? They see it just like that, even though they would use different words. We are all today the walking accumulation of all the morals of all the stories, all the main conclusions we've ever drawn, all the lessons we've ever learned, all the implications we've ever seen, all the inferences we've ever made. We all walked in here today, the walking accumulation of all that, and that's what we have. That's what themes are. They're your operating men. They are your subjective understanding of the world. You know, Chris, this guy Freeman Tilden, who said this. This guy wrote the first book on interpretation. People think I did. He was before the wheel. In 1957, this guy Freeman Tilden. How many of you have heard of Freeman Tilden before? Okay, so I'm talking to a fairly astute group here. listen, some of his principles I don't actually think stand up very well according to evidence. I'll be quite honest with you. I've never, in all the years I taught interpretation, never once that I have, my students memorize his 6 principles and vomit them back to me. It served no useful purpose. Some of them are challenged. And some of them are obtuse. I'm not even sure he quite knew what he was saying. And it was written in 1950s sort of colloquial rhetoric prose for a U.S. National Park Service ranger at the time, right? Not for all of us. And so people have turned this into kind of almost like religious dogma, right? But he said one thing that was so far-reaching. It was 30 years ahead of any theory. There's no reason to think like this or even say something like this, and certainly no research evidence to support it. But he just knew it. He was like an Einstein or a Newton in your field. He said, the chief aim of interpretation, chief aim of environmental communication, environmental education, right, is not instruction, but provocation. I like to put it this way: we're not trying to teach nothing to nobody. We're just trying to blow them away. Remember that wow moment? Wow. That, folks, according to a vast body of empirical evidence, is the phenomenon of interest for us. That's what we're after. We know we can't always get there. And maybe, you take a group of people, you take 20 people. If you get one of them walking away, I went, wow, you've done a really great job. But the closer you get to that with everyone, right, the more likely you are to make the kinds of differences that you want to make in how people think, how they feel, and given the opportunity, how they might choose to behave, right? That drove your decision to be in this field to begin with. So if you want to make a difference on purpose, you got to get people thinking. Right, now, there's just a little more to it. That's it. That's my theme. Wow. Nope, I did it again. Now, here's an idea. This is well established. What's thought-provoking is thought-provoking. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then we'll wrap it up. Let's go back to your wow moment with your book. Wow. Now, eventually, the light goes off, and that book is probably the last thought you remember thinking that night, right? And when you get up in the morning and it's laying there, triggered again, you're thinking about it again, aren't you? You go through your morning routine, you get yourself ready, and you go off, whether it's to work or school or wherever you're going, and the first person you see with whom you are socially comfortable and okay, what's the first thing that comes out of your mouth? Have you seen this book? Have you been to this movie? Have you? I mean, right? What's thought-provoking is thought-provoking. It's well established. If you're in the tourism industry, this is your bread and butter, man. This is word-of-mouth advertising, right? You're never there. Word-of-mouth advertising is found in every marketing study to be number 1 or number 2 as a source that people use primarily to make a decision to go to a particular place or to buy a particular product in general consumer behavior. Word-of-mouth advertising. Can you imagine how difficult that is to study? You got to be in people's living rooms. You got to be in the locker room. You got to be in the office, right, where this kind of stuff happens in the course of normal discourse. These brilliant people, two women, Gail Knudsen and at the University of Pennsylvania, coined a phrase. They called it conversational elaboration. That word ring a bell? Conversational elaboration. And what conversational elaboration, and they studied museums. They specifically studied families who go to museums. And they followed them around, and what they found was that the exhibits in the museum, right, created for each individual a certain amount of meaning making, of elaboration. They read something, saw something, made them think, and afterwards, if there was an opportunity for them to talk, they start to exchange their meanings that they made, right? And a whole new layer of meaning gets established for the group. Anyone who's paying attention to the conversation. Conversational elaboration. I got a question. I got a math problem for you. See if I get this right. I'll use you too. Okay. We have Dan and Chris, Jennifer and Amber. And you're all on a whale watching eco cruise in Mexico. You know, Mexico is the first country in the world to protect its waters for whales. Not U.S., not Australia, certainly not Japan. Mexico, back in the 1940s, 30s or 40s. Yeah, way back when. Isn't that amazing? Doesn't fit the stereotype, does it? And Log of the Sea of Cortez, Steinbeck, wrote about the whales. Anyway, you're down there. I work a lot with National Geographic and a company called Lindblad Expeditions. They're partners. In fact, they co-branded, and I got to facilitate the co-brand. And what they want to do is get people out in these waters and blow them away. And one day, we saw 5 species of whale. In one day, both on the Pacific side and on the Sea of Cortez side. I won't go through them now. Blue, gray, sperm, humpback, and orcas. In order, I got them. One day. Anyway, you're out in the ship one day, and here's this pod of whales, and they come up near the ship, and these are like 60 passengers, so they're not big cruise ships. And you're all out on deck, 4 of you. And you're watching. The guide is out there giving an interpretive environmental education commentary. You see, I just can't help myself but equate. And my question is this: not counting what the guide is saying, when Jennifer starts talking to Amber and Chris starts talking to Dan as the guide is talking, because what's thought-provoking is thought-provoking. How many conversations are going on? How many conversations are going on, not counting the guide? You two are talking, you two are talking. How many conversations are going on? Somebody said 4. How many think 4? How many? You see, you know it's a loaded question, don't you? You don't trust me one bit, do you? Right? It's 6. Well, that's a whole nother. I had Political Science 101 with a guy you'll know who could answer that question. His name was Gary Larson. At Washington State University in the 1970s, Gary and I had Political Science 101 together. God, I wish I'd have known what he was thinking back in those days, because I'd have spent a lot more time with him. He could answer that question. I can't touch it. Right? 6, and here's why. You got conversation, 2 of them here, and you got 2 there. That's 4. Right. Excuse me. You got 1 conversation between the 2. That makes more sense, right? And you got another conversation. There's 2 of them, right? And where do the other 4 come from? Say it. The internal conversation that each of them's got going on in their own mind. George Mead, one of the most celebrated psychologists of all time, the father of what's called symbolic interactionism, Canadian psychologist, in the 1930s, said something that seems so straightforward and obvious today. But at the time, it just wasn't the way people were thinking in psychology. Just the way Tilden said, we're not trying to teach, we're trying to provoke, which is way outside of the box in those days. Mead said, thinking is just having a conversation with yourself inside of your own head. It's even your own voice you're hearing, isn't it? Right? That's what conversational elaboration is about. Talk-provoking is talk-provoking. Can you imagine if you blow away people in your groups and they go home and they want to tell someone? Can you imagine how your impact could spread if you just get them talking? To get them talking, you got to get them thinking. And to get them thinking, according to a vast body of research, you need a strong theme presented in an ORE way. You get it? There you have it. Let me finish up now. I just want to mention one quick idea. I mentioned I work a lot in Australia, and this is probably 20 years ago now. I'm sitting there. I'm actually on my way to Tasmania, I think, and I got to give a talk somewhere. And it's like the next day, and I said, they worked me hard with it, and I haven't had time to think about what it's going to be yet. I got to stand up and pull something out of my you-know-what that relates to experience and thinking, because experience is thinking. That's what experience is. It's not what you do. It's not what you think about what you're doing or how you evaluate what you're doing. It's the thoughts you're thinking as you're doing it. So you got two people walking side by side down the same trail on the same substrate under the same sky in the same identical physical reality. And the woman on the left is having the time of her life, and the guy on the right is miserable. So much for physical reality, right? It's all subjective. It's experience because they're thinking different things. Right? That's what experience is in the tourism field. So I want to talk to them about that. Right? And then I flip open this. I'm not getting anywhere, and I flip open this Qantas Flight magazine, and I find this ad for Financial Times, which is in the weekend edition, which is a financial newspaper, a lot like the Wall Street Journal, but in Australia, UK, it's Financial Times. And it shows these guys. Notice up there at the top on the left. I didn't put that there. They did. This is some clever graphic designer. It kind of irritated me because by now I've spent 30 plus years trying to research this and bring empirical integrity to this approach to communication, always burdened by the need to have evidence to support it or not. And here this kid just whips this drawing out. It captures all of it. So much for that. But what I loved about it was here you have these people, and they've all read the same edition of the newspaper. And they're pictured sitting around this table now talking about it. They've been provoked to talk about it, right? Think of it that way. And they're all talking about different aspects of it. Not one of them has read the whole paper. Do you read a newspaper from the front page to the last page, starting at the upper left and then working way down there? No, you browse, don't you? You read a little of this. Usually you start with the front page headline, but you're looking at headlines and images, aren't you, to decide even where to stop. Right? And that's the way you do. And you don't go in any particular order, and you just go in whatever. And so no two people read the newspaper the same way. And certainly nobody reads it all. And so if somebody came in with a clipboard and gave them all a test over that edition of the newspaper, they'd all fail, wouldn't they? But that's not our construct of excellence. Our construct of excellence is thinking. Every one of them has read something that has provoked them to think so much that they now want to tell another person about it. Isn't that sort of what's being depicted here? Can you get that? Right? And I thought of this, and I said, I have to have this. I actually asked them, Chris, for permission to include this image in my book. I said, free advertising for them. And frankly, for at least 100,000 people. I mean, that's what's happening. They said, no, we don't do permissions, but we don't do permissions. I said, fine. So I did it myself. Well, I mean, I've been married to a graphic. I'm not an artist, but I married one for that reason. She's brilliant. Barbara is a brilliant graphic designer. And so I just wondered, instead of having read a newspaper, what if these people had been to your environmental education program? What if they'd been on your field trip? What if they'd been somewhere in your estuary or out on the river or at the wildlife refuge or here in the wet facility going through the exhibits, right? And what would I want them to be saying? How would I prefer that they fill in those empty dialogue bubbles? If I think like this, if I envision this is what word of mouth advertising tries to do. This is what people are doing in the living room at home, isn't it? After they've been with you for the day, at the dinner table that night. What would I want them to be? Even though I won't be there to observe this, how would I design things so that these are the thoughts I would stimulate, and these are the things that I would want them to say, realizing, and every teacher knows this, often, one of your students, how many of you have taught or do? You know that when one of your students says something to you, utters an inference that you know you did not teach them, but you also know full well it is based on something you did teach them, and they took it that level, how does that make you feel? Wow, that's what I'm talking about. And so often I can't envision what those would be. They're surprises, right? And so, I mean, I'm not saying you want to make a list of the thoughts that are acceptable to you, but I'm just saying that this should be what guides our decisions about creative design and the content and the organization of it. How I use the T and the O-R-N-E to create that conversation. And I think about this at the beginning. When designing a new exhibit, I'm thinking this way. Designing a new talk, think about this way. As I designed this talk for you, I thought this way. And if I gave you all a test over what I talked about these last hour and a half, if I was banking on that, I'd be sadly disappointed, because I know I could come up with questions that a lot of you wouldn't be able to answer, not because you're not smart, not because you didn't pay attention. I'm seeing a lot of attention paying, but because I hope you're thinking your own thoughts and you're making your own meanings. That's what I wanted. And the rest is up to you. If you look at my model, it's in chapter 5, Chris. You look at the actual model. I didn't bring, because I didn't want to go there with you today. But you can Google it. It's online. It's got like 6 boxes in it, and only the first 2 are you. The rest is up to the audience. The audience is active. The audience is not a sponge that you pound information into. How many of you know what constructivist learning is? Constructivism. The idea that you can, no teacher, no communicator, no communicator of any kind can pound knowledge into some learner's head. All you can do is facilitate a process of thinking and meaning making through which they construct their own subjective knowledge, hopefully based upon the facts you've given them. So it's not going to be too far awry in terms of its factual integrity, right? But you must get them to construct their own knowledge. That's why it's called constructivist learning theory. If you're not hip to constructivism or constructivist learning, right, theory, Google it too. You will be happy with it. And it's perfectly consistent with this. And the best schools and universities and the most, but I believe the most successful and accomplished educators in the history of the world have been constructivist teachers. One guy was so good at it, we named a method after him. His name was Socrates. How did Socrates teach? What's the Socratic method? Asking questions. Asking questions, getting you to think about the question. And then every now and then, a good constructive teacher will do this, then check in or step in and do a little check for understanding. So let me ask you this now. And the response you get tells you if they're on board, if you're happy with that, or do you still need to do a little tweaking, right? Well, Johnny, why do you think 2 + 2 is 5? Let's talk about this for a minute. Until you tweak, right? Constructive, that's all this is. It's based on the idea that you can't make people care. We've been telling people to care, and we've been telling them that they should appreciate forever, and it's never worked, not once. Let's get them to do the thinking. Now the chances are much, much enhanced of actually getting that done. Okay, finally, you wanted me to mention evaluations. I'll mention evaluations. Chapter 8, Chris, the zone of tolerance. It's the most important idea, I think, that I've had in a long time. It was actually going to be the first chapter, Chris. By the time I got done, it turned out to be the 8th. It's connected to this graphic. You can evaluate how well you're doing if the idea that our job is to stimulate people to think their own thoughts, then those thoughts must somehow figure into whether we're doing a good job or a bad job, right? I mean, they got to step in there somehow. And this is where the zone of tolerance idea occurred to me a long time ago. We can ask people to tell us what they're thinking. It's actually a common method in psychology. It's been used in, 500-600 studies. It's called thought listening. We do all that. It's been used in interpretive research as well, right? Too, one of my PhD students and a master's student, both. And now I was for 4 years working based at a university in Sweden, in Uppsala, and they're doing this throughout their entire nature center system throughout the country of Sweden now, using thought listing. Asking people, what are you thinking? And if you listen to what people are now thinking, say they're thinking as a result of something you did with them, you will know for yourself. You will hear in their words how well you did, because you either will be happy with it or not. Happy or not, that's what I call the zone of tolerance. I don't mean tolerance as in tolerating, some kind of, social category. I mean tolerance in the sense of, like, if you're machining a bearing or something, you got a certain amount of tolerance to make it sure that it's accurate and precise, right? It's what you want. So using this thought listing method, Google thought listing. You see, I'm all over Google, aren't I? Thank God for Google. How well are you doing? Are there thoughts that they're expressing to you supportive and consistent with the kinds of differences you're trying to make, right? If someone says, what I'm thinking now is, boy, I never realized how important water was. I didn't realize how fragile it was. Are you smiling? Of course you are. Another person says, I'm so sick of these greenies telling me how to live my life. You happy with that? No. See, it's easy. What are they thinking? In other words, are there thoughts within your zone of tolerance? Now, you always wonder, well, what determines how wide a zone of tolerance is? How forgiving and is it? Well, that depends on you. It's a philosophical question only you can answer, or perhaps your organization has a mission. Right? Sometimes your zone of tolerance is wide and forgiving, so wide and forgiving that all thoughts are okay. Where you reason, it doesn't matter what any of us thinks personally. The important thing is that we're thinking about it at all. Right? And a lot of social issues are in this category. And sometimes issues are so controversial or touchy, right, that politically you don't want to go there, but you want people to think about it. How many of you work with museums at all? There's an organization in the world that I gave a keynote address at their conference years ago in Australia called IMTAL, IMTAL, the International Museum and Theater Alliance, using theater to deal with difficult issues because these are actors. This is pretend. And so you can go places that somebody actually wearing the logo and representing an agency or an organization doesn't have the political capital to touch, because it can come back to backfire on you. I mean, like the Enola Gay exhibition in Smithsonian years ago on the first atomic bomb that was dropped, that exhibit never happened. In fact, Google that. Go to Amazon. The book's called the Enola Gay, the exhibit that never happened, right? Because there were people that wanted to make that wanted to glorify the great, what an important moment in history it was, and as difficult as the decision was, it was necessary at the time and all that, right? And then there's a whole other group of people that said, no, this is the most evil, awful technology ever invented. Everybody associated with it was a devil, and we must get rid of it, and this must never, ever happen again in humankind anywhere on the planet. And then the other side is saying, wait a minute, but my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandfather all fought in that war, and they weren't evil people. How dare you? And all these people were going at it, and this was being fought in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. It finally got to the point that the director of Smithsonian was fired by Congress, lost his job, and the exhibit never happened. Read the book. It's cool. This is how sometimes sensitive issues, right, that you must have a very wide zone of tolerance, right? Sensitive, touchy issues. There are some issues I'll bet some of you deal with that are highly political, not because they are to you, but because your organizations are wrapped up in a political reality that they can't escape. And so you got to tread on some issues carefully. Am I right about that? Right? So they would fall in this category. The wide zone is very wide and forgiving, but always limited by some type of value system. For example, I used to go round and round with a colleague in Washington, D.C. With the National Park Service, Dave Larson, great friend who tragically died. Dave was actually going to write the foreword for my book, and then he died of a heart attack a month before. But I used to say, Dave, he'd say, the National Park Service has an unlimited zone of tolerance. Once I got him into my terminology, was putting it that way. And I said, no, you don't, Dave. You have a wide zone of tolerance, but it's not unlimited. And he said, no, it's unlimited. It's all about democracy. All ideas are worthy. I said, yeah, as long as they're appreciative of the national park idea. He goes, well, yeah. There's a value system. Yeah. You think whatever you want, as long as it's appreciative, as long as it's caring, as long as it acknowledges the value of the national park concept, that sort of thing. And then there's a narrow zone, and sometimes a narrow zone is unavoidable. I mean, how many of you work with formal environmental education, meaning connected to a school curriculum? Mandate. Kids are responsible for certain kinds of information, and they will be accountable to mastering it, and you got to direct your efforts to that. And so in this zone of tolerance, you're saying, well, look, all meanings are great. I want to blow your mind, right? But some meanings are more important than others, right? And those are the ones you're going to be held accountable for. So there's a narrow zone of tolerance there, right? If the kids are thinking thoughts that don't include those few key important ones, right, then you haven't done a good job. And see, this is all about how well are you doing, and should you, if you're not doing so well, if they're thinking thoughts that are not in your zone of tolerance, you need to re-examine how you're doing things and see if you can improve. Because the whole idea is to achieve excellence, which is all those kids in the dirt on their hands and knees thinking their own thoughts. Also in the narrow zone, I mentioned I do a lot of work in behavior. I mean, everything from this philanthropy stuff, talked about people donating money, that's the behavior, right? To getting people to stay on designated trails, getting them not to feed birds in national parks, getting them to keep their dogs on leashes in areas where there's wildlife. This is almost all done in Australia. I mentioned storing food property in Yosemite National Park, taking a shuttle bus instead of driving your own cars into another national park, and some others. Well, yeah, it's great for them to think all kinds of things, but there are certain beliefs about the behavior that you want them to do that you must get into their psyche. They must give thought to those. Those are the reasons they would do what you want them to do. We spend a lot of time, too much time is wasted, I think, worrying about why people are doing the wrong thing. Knowing why they're doing the wrong thing can be useful and informative to a certain point. But from a strategic communication point of view, imagine how much more targeted and focused you can be with your communication if you could only figure out not just why are they doing the wrong thing, but why would they do the right thing. You see, that's what the theory another theory that I use informs us with. When we know why they would, what are the reasons that normal people would have for doing what you want? And then we focus our TORE communication on those, right? Then we got a better chance to bring about behavior, and we've had great success with this all over the place, right? Doing just that in terms of increasing statistically the outcome. We eliminated bird feeding in one picnic area in a national park in Australia. In another national park, we got people to pick up other people's litter, increased it by 21% over a control group when there was no communication at all. And the baseline was already 50, so over 70% of the people are now picking up other people's litter. Can you imagine how important that was to Parks and Wildlife Tasmania in terms of what it cost them to maintain that trail, and also the experience that people had walking that trail, right? And the ecological integrity of the place. So that's a big deal when you do this homework. And so I hope you can see that's why it's a narrow zone of tolerance, because think whenever they want, they at least got to be thinking about the reasons that we determined through a research process that those people, that audience, would be more likely to do what we wanted, and then focus their thinking on that. Okay, folks. I want to leave you with this. You make a purposeful difference. You want to make a difference on purpose? Get your audiences, whoever they are, get them thinking their own thoughts and making their own meanings that fall within your zone of tolerance. And whenever their thoughts make you smile, you pat yourself on the back because you achieved success that day. Do it in the long haul, and you've achieved, I guess, excellence. If you do it consistently, I guess that means you're excellent, right? And if sometimes they're thinking thoughts that are problematic, well, go back and look at what you're doing and say, why are those people thinking? What am I doing? Am I saying or showing or doing something that's causing that to happen? You see, this is a feedback mechanism. This is how you evaluate, not in the sense of passing judgment on something, but how you continually improve it, which is kind of what we do in the so-called pursuit of excellence. So, okay, well, that's what I have for you today. Thank you. You've been really kind. I hope I didn't bore you. And I'd be really happy to have questions, discussion, and see where we go from there. Thank you, Amber, Jennifer. How many are thinking right now? See, just check for understanding. That's all we're doing. Okay, good. Yeah. Sometimes, we have the saying. The saying, and again, it's you in your bed having just your wow moment with this book, and another person walks in after the clipboard thing failed and walks in and says, "Yeah, but just tell me, what are you thinking now?" We have this saying in English that I think captures this, and you'll find in other languages too. I'm sure you would have a refrane or something from Costa Rica. You ever say, "Could you come back later? I need to collect my thoughts." It's this idea that these thoughts are flying around like molecules in a vacuum, and you need to grab them, bring them in, make some sense of it, right? Right. That's kind of what I think is going on when we really kind of achieve this phenomenon of interest I'm talking about, I call blowing away or provocation, elaboration. It's kind of, and so when you sit down people to talk to them about what they're thinking, give them a moment. Give them a moment. Have a cup of coffee or a glass of water or something, and let them collect their thoughts and talk to them. Question?
I was wondering if you could expound a little bit more about philanthropy and the link between the philanthropy and the interpretation, and how you inspired people in Galapagos to give $60 million dollars, how we can use that on the ground here in Puget Sound for birds or for fish or for wherever it is we're out there talking about. How can we use that locally? Take that back to here.
A couple of things there. One, when I was talking about this research process where we determine why would people do the right thing, that's the theoretical model. It's called the reasoned action model, or its older iteration, the theory of planned behavior, and before that, the theory of reasoned action. Today, it's kind of called the reasoned action model. That is based on this idea that people have beliefs about everything. To a behavioral psychologist and to somebody who wants to use communication strategically in order to influence a behavior, right? The first thing you do is to define the behavior. Is somebody doing something at a certain time and place or not? It can be an action or an inaction. Somebody taking the shuttle bus instead of driving their own car in a national park is an action. Somebody not feeding the birds, refraining from doing a bad behavior that we've defined as being negative or bad, right? That's an inaction, right? So, now in Galapagos, and I would say in Baja California in Mexico, again, working with National Geographic and Lindblad Expeditions, in Churchill, Canada, working with Natural Habitat Adventures, another really enlightened tour company that I have the pleasure to work with a lot, and their travel partner is not National Geographic, but World Wildlife Fund. And so we there it's more of a worldwide conservation campaign, but using polar bears. If you've been to Churchill, Canada, northern Manitoba, that's what it's all about. This is an amazing place, by the way. To connect people profoundly to a place, in this case, to a species or the plight of that species, right? And then before they leave, give them an opportunity to act on it. And actually, in the case of World Wildlife Fund, it actually, because they don't, that's not a model they use. They actually wait till people get back home, and then they hit them with their corporate sort of philanthropy communication program, which is they know it's one step removed. And in Galapagos, in Baja California, and again in the Arctic, we did it with National Geographic and Lindblad. That was a worldwide oceans program called Ocean Blue. And the campaign was called Voice of the Ocean. And we told these people, you're the voice of the ocean. Let's inspire you to go back home and do good things. Right? Those had clearly defined behaviors. Now, what you talked about, how do we do it for fish and how we do it for wildlife? See, I didn't hear behavior. Right? Now, let's step back. The behavior is more likely to happen if an attitude, a positive attitude, precedes it. Not an attitude about the environment or nature or clean this or dirty that. The only attitude that matters is the attitude they have about the behavior. To have a positive attitude about the behavior. Is doing what you want me to do a good thing? That's a positive attitude about the behavior. That's what we want. And strong attitude that is a result of a lot of elaboration includes lots of positive thinking about the benefits or the good consequences that would ensue from doing this behavior. That will lead to the behavior. In the case you talked about, fish and wildlife are not. They're objects. They're concepts, or they're objects, or they're physical phenomena, not behaviors. And so the attitude we're after is about them. And we'll still hold up. It's just we're not after a behavior. So what we're saying is, if you want people to appreciate, remember, appreciate is a generally positive attitude about something, right? So if you want them to appreciate fish, appreciate wildlife, right, then that's what you got to get them to do. You got them thinking, get them thinking positive, pro-wildlife thoughts. And the more specific you get to the species, the more likely you are to get it done. You can see why, right? Right. And so in the case of a polar bear, right, that's an easy connection to make. But making a connection with wildlife generally is a harder connection to make in a communication program. There are people like us who relate strongly to the general concept of wildlife, but most normal people, I think, connect strongly on a good day to a particular species or even a particular individual of a species. And so we need to keep that in mind. The same with fish. Fish are harder because they're harder to see. and harder something is to see. Not that wildlife are easy to see, but they're easier to see because they're terrestrial, most of them. We think of fish and wildlife, so I'm making that. It's a false distinction, I know, because fish are wildlife, but you see what I'm saying? Anything that lives in nocturnal animals in general. I mean, nocturnal birds have suffered a serious, setback in some states in the U.S. because nobody sees them, and so they're the subject of all kinds of misconceptions and even superstitions, right? And we saw that in the Midwest with swifts and really ground nesting nocturnal birds, owls, swifts, etc. So am I kind of getting at your question?
Yeah, I want to talk more about philanthropy.
Okay, philanthropy then is focused on the behavior. If somebody asks me, and again, I can send you a chapter I wrote for Stanford University on this for an organization called CREST, Center for Responsible and Sustainable Tourism, on a traveler's philanthropy handbook. It was actually, this whole effort was in part inspired by the success we had in Galapagos in 1998. And and at the beginning of this chapter, I say they wanted me to write about the ask, and I said I wouldn't, because that's not what it's about. It's an offer. It's an offer. A philanthropic act is one of the most selfish things any human being does. I know for folks like us, we have a lot of money, maybe really don't, think of ourselves as philanthropists, right? And so we think when we're asking somebody else for money that we're asking them to sacrifice. No, we're not. No, we're giving them an offer to do something that will serve their most selfish motive, to feel good for simply having done it. That's what philanthropy is. It means love of people, or in this case, love of something. Love, anthropy. And so that's the first thing. And so I'd say, if you ask me, how do you design a traveler's philanthropy or philanthropy program that stands the greatest chance of success, I would say the first thing you do is you hire great interpreters, right? Guides, interpreters, environmental educators, whatever the budget says you are. I don't care. Hire folks like you. Train them well in this approach, right? And then you connect those people strongly to the place through an outstanding interpretive program that includes in it. It includes in it the reasons that we identified through this research process, which you can do, by the way. I teach this all the time in Australia. In fact, I do workshops every year in Australia for them on how to ask the questions to get the information to decide to determine what are the most likely reasons people would have, normal people, for doing the right thing. Arm your messages with these. Integrate some of these into your messages. We never mention the fund. We never mention donating until it's all done privately in the people's cabin on the Thursday night before they disembark for the final time on Saturday morning. And so Thursday night, when they go back to their cabins after dinner and so-called cabin turn down, they go in, they find the sheets are turned, and on the pillow is a little gold chocolate, that kind of stuff at night. But on Thursday night, also, there's this little brochure, it's just photocopied, that has in it some of this information. But all around the ship, there's FAQ panels, and there's exhibits, and there's a little visitor center where a piano used to be, but no longer is. I got rid of it. And put in an interpretive center instead, and then all the guides and all the islands. Every island in Galapagos has a different set of possibilities in terms of there are different species. That's why Darwin was down there. Right? And so these guides are trained in what the key messages are, and where on Floriana Island, where the group is on Wednesday afternoon, these kind of opportunities exist. But when you get to Isabela Island or Santiago Island and other days, there are different opportunities because the stories are different, right? To weave in some of these messages. And in fact, I'm willing to share the report with you if you want. It's about 29 megs, but I can make it available to you in a Dropbox. And to work those into their commentaries, right? And then no mention of the fund, no mention about money, any of that stuff. Just put the little brochure telling about the fund and how you go about donating in their pillow on Thursday night in the cabin. And after doing that in 1998 and setting this up, once we started putting that brochure in the pillow and everybody was trained and the FAQ panels were up, and it was even stuff they got in the mail before they went on the trip, it emphasized some of these messages. All of a sudden, donations quadrupled in 6 months. They just quadrupled. Our goal was 30%, 277% increase in 6 months. And so it's like I say, I'm not making anything up here. It really does work, but you got to do your homework. Now, again, these questions are real simple. There's like mainly about 6 of them. When it comes to doing X, when it comes to donating on the Saturday morning before you leave the boat for the last time, donating to the Galapagos, to a fund like this, to a conservation fund, right? What would be the good things that would happen as a result? The upside. And then how about the downside, the flip side of that? Are there any bad things that could happen if you donate the fund? Those are the 2 things, right? That's called a behavioral belief. And there's also a normative belief. Norms have to do with what other people think, right? Well, listen, can you think of anybody, either groups or individuals, that when it comes to doing this thing and donating to a fund like this, that would be happy that you did it? That would, encourage you to do it? Well, how about anybody that would discourage you? Anybody be unhappy? Right? Look for possible normative influences. And then finally, control beliefs. These are also called perceived behavioral control or self-efficacy. If you take Psych 101, you learned about self-efficacy. Are you locus of control, it's also called? Are you can you do it if you want to? Or are there things that are difficult for you to do? And control beliefs are what people perceive to be facilitators or inhibitors. What are the things that, when it comes to donating to a fund like this, that would make it easier for you to do it? And are there any factors or circumstances that would make it more difficult, right? You get answers to those questions from enough people who are representative of the audience you want to have success with, right? And look at what they tell you, and then you develop messages based upon what you've learned, right? And that's what we did. Usually, then you can do it in a perfect world. You now have an opportunity. That's all qualitative research based on open-ended questions and interview, and you're recording what people say. But usually, in a perfect world, you now have a chance to go back, take the most frequently mentioned reasons they gave, right, and then give them and this is a quantitative stage of research, to independent samples of people who are known to already do it. They're called known compliers. People who already donate, for example. People who already stay on the trail. People who already pick up other people's litter. People who already take the shuttle bus rather than drive their own cars. Okay? Known compliers. And also a sample of known non-compliers, where you hide and you watch the people do the wrong thing, and then you jump out and you give them a questionnaire. And you measure the strength of these beliefs. All the most frequently mentioned ones are called modal beliefs, modal salient beliefs. And you measure them and see which ones are different. Right? And the reason you look for what's different is that for example, the Staying on the Trail study, it was in a national park called Port Campbell National Park on the Great Ocean Road outside of Melbourne, Australia. Anybody have been there? 12 Apostles trail with these amazing rocks out in the water. Actually, only 6 now because one actually fell over. I think I heard that. Anyway, we went and we talked to people, and we said, so what would be the main reasons you'd want to stay on the trail? What would be the good things? And they said, well, it would be certainly, we'd be safer, right? Because there are snakes and things in Australia, this, and also these cliffs easily crumble and you can fall off, and people do fall off and die, so definitely safer. And also, they said it'd be better for the environment. 96% of them said both of those things. They said it's safer and I'd have less impact on the environment. This is what the audience said. Well, you go to the trailhead, and what's the sign that the park has up? Already. It says, please stay on this trail. It's better for the environment and you'll be safer. How do you expect to improve on the status quo if you're already telling people what they already think? Right? And so this is a park to guessing. This is why we do this research. Right? It turns out there was only one difference. When we compared compliers and non-compliers, both thought, it's better for the environment, no different. Both thought, it's safer, no different. And a number of other things that were all the same out of about 40 beliefs. There was only one that when we compared the two, that was different. So different that we said if we got any chance to make a difference, if there's any what I call persuasion potential, it's focusing on this. And I asked the park managers, what would it be? None of them. This is why we do the research, because even we, the researchers, couldn't have predicted it. That's why we asked the question. The only belief that differentiated between them was the belief that people who stayed on the trail, people who doing the right thing, the wanted thing, said that was different than what people who got off the trail said, was that these people believed that if they got off the trail, they're more likely to get better views and photos. And these people stayed on the trail because they didn't think that was necessarily the case. They thought you'd get just good views and photos. So what do? What does it tell you as an applied communicator? How would you keep more people on the trail? Let's say you're going to make a sign. You're going to have like 65 words on it. You're going to plop it in the middle of the trail, an A-frame sign, a sandwich board sign. You see, once you know what you're trying to accomplish, it's pretty obvious, right? And it was a letter from a woman named Terry. And remember, this is research, right? So this is from a woman named Terry. We use Terry because a male or a female could be named Terry, so there's no gender issue there. And it said, a letter to Parks Victoria. That's the name of the management agency. National parks are managed by states in Australia. Maybe you knew that. And a letter to Parks Victoria. Dear Parks Victoria, I just want to thank you for putting this trail here. I'm a professional photographer. I make my living from the photographs that I sell from this viewpoint, and you have put this boardwalk in the perfect place because I get the very best views and photos possible, right, from this standpoint. Appreciate it, Terry. And that significantly increased the number of people staying on the trail while the sign was up compared to a control group. Okay, so just so you see, and so in Galapagos, we targeted the reasons why people would donate. And there we targeted the one reason why people would stay in the trail. The reason that people would pick up other people's litter had to do with setting a good example. If somebody else is watching, it'll set a good example, right? And that was the only about, again, 40-some beliefs that separated the two. So this is why you do the research. But folks, I'm not trying to get you to do this research, right? I'm trying to show you that it can be done. Yes, I have a methodology. Yes, I developed it for non-psychologists, non-people who know nothing about communication theory or psychology, people who know nothing about statistics or quantitative analysis. I developed a methodology with some colleagues in Australia for people just like you to be able to do these questions, and rather than relying on statistical analysis, you can eyeball a difference. You can look at two averages, two means, and see if they're bigger, if that difference is bigger than it is between other, and so you can, with your own eyeballs, find the beliefs. And if you want that, I'll send it to you. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is, so I'm not sending, you got your network, right? I don't have this network. I can send these things to you if you want, Jennifer, or you and Amber, and then you could make them available to anyone who's interested. How's that sound? So I feel like I've dominated all this question and answer period on this one question, but I hope this is useful. This logic is clean enough that you're able to follow it more or less. So I apologize if not.
Hey, Sam, I was thinking a lot about when you were saying that it's important for your audience to have time to think, to form their own ideas, and to talk with other people. One thing we do in our school program is we, after we provide some content in an exciting way that appeals to that audience, we let them work in small groups. They talk to each other, they identify a problem, they identify a solution to that problem, and they present it to the rest of the class.
That's perfect.
Do you have maybe one other example that people could use, a very specific technique
Sure.
to help stimulate that, whether it's on a trail or in a room?
It's the most obvious one of all. Hey, thanks for coming along today. Hope you had a good time. Now, what's the coolest thing you saw out there today? There you go. It's through questions. You ask the question, and not rhetorical questions, not yes or no questions, not right or wrong questions, but subjective questions that capture what they perceived, right? What's the coolest thing you saw out there today? On these ships I'm talking about, these not related to the philanthropy program, I do a lot of guide training, and one of the things I train guides to do is you never, ever, ever give up your microphone in a group. You just don't do it because you'll never get it back, and someone is going to keep it forever. So you always hold it, but you walk around and you ask people, so what'd you see out there today that you thought was pretty cool, right? How about you? Anybody else want to add to that? And you go around and you get people talking, and you can see the conversational elaboration that's happening. So that's a very simple thing to do. But I like what you're doing too. Provoke them to think, which provokes them to talk, and now orchestrate the opportunity to get the talking going. Yeah. Brilliant. Nice job.
Maybe one more question?
I just wanted to go back to something you had said to me specifically.
Well, I hope they were nice.
I mean, I think that probably all of us deal with this bias in an audience that we're talking to, a general audience, that whole sort of like, I'm so tired of the greenies telling me what to do, or I'm so tired of the government telling me what to do, or so how to overcome that bias that is inherent in many audiences?
Well, you know, when you've got a bias processor, you can almost predict a boomerang effect, because the two things, I didn't talk about these, but the two stars that must align to have what is called high elaboration likelihood, high probability that you're going to get them thinking, are that it's got to be easy to process. That sound familiar from Tor? It's isn't it? Right? Short, simple, uses their language, right? Easy to process, organized so they don't get lost, not overwhelmed. And they got to be motivated to process it. That's the R. It's got to matter to them, right? You can lead a horse to water, but if that horse isn't thirsty, if that water's not relevant, he's not going to drink it, right? So O and R. Right? You make a message, and if you have a message that's O and R, it has high elaboration likelihood, or what I call high provocation likelihood, right? And therefore, you're probably going to get people thinking about it. All right, that's what a strong message is. Well, you get somebody who's biased processor thinking about what you're saying, and they're going to think all negative, all questioning, all I don't trust you, all you're lying to me, I don't like you. All that stuff's going to get reinforced, and what you're going to do is further polarize them in their direction opposite of what you wanted. With time, by the way, it tends to come back to where they started, but the immediate result is that they're further, angry at you. So how do you diffuse that? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just got to accept the fact that there's no way you're going to reach these folks. The more they've thought about it, the harder the nut they are to crack. We already talked about that. The more they have experience with it. Try going to Forks, Washington, and telling them that okay, now we need to protect the spotted owl. All right, try doing that. Right, so it's not going to happen. Right, so keep that in mind. However, in my experience, what has worked for me is to acknowledge that up front. Listen, hey, I know what you're all thinking. I get it. I totally get it. I want to acknowledge that. I don't want to just kind of dismiss it and not mention it. I want to put it right out there on the table up front, right? And to say, but nevertheless, listen, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind here today, but there's some things I think we can all think about, and these are them. And so offer it as a conversation rather than as a mind-molding sort of effort. Does that make sense? When we any of us perceive that somebody is trying to persuade us of something, just instinctively those shackles of resistance come up, don't they? And we see through it, and then from that point on, they're wasting their time because we become biased processors because we don't trust their motives, right? And so let's at least diffuse that before we start. That'd be my recommendation.
It just makes me think about the being in uniform versus not being in uniform, and I've attended meetings both ways, and what a big difference that can make. But usually, most people are representing, an organization, and so that bias is like right there. Somebody may have some previous experience with that agency or that entity. So I think that kind of ties into what you were just talking about. I think it can be an added challenge.
It is, and I'm glad you made that observation. Sometimes it's good to take the shirt off, man. If you want to get it done. I for years I've done. I know it sounds like I've done everything, but I truly did work for 25 years in international development in developing countries all over Latin America and the Caribbean and some in Asia. And one of the most interesting days I've ever had was this happened to be in Galapagos Islands. Actually, it wasn't because I was working with Galapagos then, but because a meeting of U.S. Peace Corps, Associate Peace Corps directors. These are the individuals who are host country nationals, right? Who work for the U.S. Peace Corps based in usually the capital cities of those countries, right? Who manage different sectors. And the APCD for Natural Resources and Environment were all invited from all of Latin America and all the Caribbean were invited and brought to Galapagos Islands for these meetings. And I was asked to go down and participate and help facilitate stuff. I used to work with Peace Corps a lot in the old days, even though I was never a Peace Corps volunteer. And I stood up in a talk that I gave, and I have all these bureaucrats from Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the room, USAID, State Department, embassy people like that, along with these Associate Peace Corps volunteers. And I said, like I saw it, I said, you guys, you developed some amazing environmental education materials all over Latin America. I mean, really good, based upon the best theory, the best models, the best approach. Teachers were involved, even local teachers from the country were involved, developing these activities that were very culturally appropriate, very age appropriate, and very curriculum appropriate for these kids. This was awesome stuff. And they weren't being used. Because on the logo, or on the cover of every one of them was about 4 logos, and 3 of them would have been U.S. government logos: Peace Corps, USAID, and maybe one other. Could have been the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Park Service, whoever else was involved. Those logos represent to these people the meddling of outsiders in their sovereign affairs. Can't we sometimes be content just to do the good work and take our logos off of it? The reason this was the most interesting day for me is that 2 groups of people came up to me at different points in time that night. Now, after my speech, we were drinking and eating and music and all that stuff. And one group was these APCDs from these host country nationals from Honduras and Chile and Jamaica and, and El Salvador, Nicaragua, come up and saying, God, you're the first gringo. One Guatemalan said, you're the first gringo I ever trusted. Honestly, he told me that. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure you should go that far, but he did. He didn't for this reason. He says, that's so true, right? And then also I got heat from all the bureaucrats saying, that's totally out of line. What an inappropriate thing. You're out of line to even come here and say that. I was made to be. And so you can see the differing points of view. But it goes back to your point. That's a wise thing to do sometimes. Don't wear the colors. Be content to let your message do its magic. You can go put the uniform on later, right? And then you can still give credit because it's all about being visible, isn't it? It's about your agency being seen to be doing something valuable. And so you want the logo on the cover. That's kind of goes, but you can achieve that same purpose in other ways, maybe. So I'm just saying, for whatever that's worth, that's my thinking. We're over time. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a lot of information that we'll be able to provide to the network to kind of continue these conversations and get more resources from Sam. And thanks everyone for coming today. And thank you so much, Chris, for connecting us. It was really wonderful. Woo!